The jagged peaks of the Peruvian Andes pierced the sky like ancient teeth, their snow-capped summits shrouded in mist and mystery. Among these titans of rock and ice stood Silla Grande, a mountain that had long captured the imagination of climbers worldwide. Its west face, a formidable wall of near-vertical ice and rock, had never been successfully scaled. For Joe Simpson and Simon Yates, two young British climbers with dreams as tall as the mountains they sought to conquer, Silla Grande represented the ultimate challenge. They had spent years honing their skills on the unforgiving faces of Europe's Alps and Scotland's winter climbs. Now, standing at the base of this Andean giant, they felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation that only true adventurers can understand. As they made their final preparations, checking and rechecking their gear, Joe couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. Was it just pre-climb jitters? Or something more? He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the task ahead. Little did he know that this climb would test not just his physical abilities, but the very limits of human endurance and will. Asterisk dreaming of your own mountain adventure? Sign up for our Peak Seekers newsletter and get expert tips, gear reviews, and inspiring stories delivered straight to your inbox. Asterisk Part 1, The Ascent Chapter 1. Into the unknown, the first rays of dawn were just beginning to paint the eastern sky when Joe and Simon began their ascent. The air was thin and bitingly cold, their breath forming small clouds with each exhalation. They moved in perfect synchronization, years of climbing together having forged an unspoken bond. As they ascended, the world below gradually fell away. Valleys that had seemed vast from the ground now appeared as mere wrinkles in the Earth's surface. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic sound of their ice axes biting into the frozen face of the mountain. Joe paused briefly to take in the view. The panorama that stretched out before him was breathtaking. An endless sea of peaks and clouds that seemed to stretch to the very edges of the earth. In that moment, all the hardships and risks of climbing seemed worth it. This was why he climbed. For moments like these, when the world fell away and he felt truly alive. Chapter 2. The rhythm of the climb. As the day wore on, Joe and Simon settled into the familiar rhythm of the climb. Each movement was deliberate, each placement of hand or foot carefully considered. The west face of Silla Grande was living up to its fearsome reputation. Sections of near-vertical ice alternated with treacherous rock faces, demanding every ounce of skill and concentration the climbers possessed. By mid-afternoon, they had made good progress, but the summit still loomed far above. As they paused to rehydrate and check their position, Joe couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They were attempting something that had never been done before, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in alpine-style climbing. Simon, always the more cautious of the two, voiced his concerns about the weather. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, hinting at the possibility of a storm. They knew that in the high Andes, weather could change in an instant, turning a challenging climb into a life-threatening situation. After a brief discussion, they decided to push on. The allure of the summit was too strong, the possibility of success too tantalizing to ignore. As they resumed their climb, neither man could have imagined the ordeal that lay ahead. Chapter 3. Summit Fever. As the second day of their climb dawned, Joe and Simon found themselves in a race against time and nature. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, the clear skies of yesterday replaced by ominous clouds and gusting winds. But they were close now, so close to the summit that they could almost taste the victory. The final push to the top was a blur of exertion and determination. Every muscle ached, every breath was a struggle in the thin air. But step by agonizing step, they inched closer to their goal. When they finally crested the summit ridge, emotions overwhelmed them. They had done it. They had conquered the west face of Silla Grande. Standing atop the mountain, buffeted by winds and surrounded by a sea of clouds, Joe felt a sense of elation unlike anything he had ever experienced. They had pushed themselves to the limit and beyond, achieving something that many had deemed impossible. As they shook hands and embraced, both men knew that this was a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. But their jubilation was short-lived. As they began to discuss their descent, the first snowflakes began to fall. The storm they had feared was upon them, and they were about to face a challenge far greater than the climb itself. Asterisk, want to experience the thrill of summiting a peak without leaving your home? Try our new VR climbing experience. Use code Simpson for a 20% discount on your first month. Asterisk Part 2. The Descent into Darkness Chapter 4. The storm unleashed a descent from the summit of Silla Grande quickly turned into a nightmare. What had started as a light snowfall rapidly escalated into a full-blown blizzard. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the wind howled with a fury that seemed almost personal in its intensity. Joe and Simon fought against the elements with every step. The snow, whipped into a frenzy by the wind, stung their faces and made it difficult to see. Ice formed on their clothing and gear, adding weight and hampering their movements. Progress was agonizingly slow. Each foot of elevation lost a small victory against the mountain and the storm. As night began to fall, they faced a grim reality that they would not make it off the mountain before darkness enveloped them. With no choice but to continue, they pressed on, relying on their headlamps and instincts to guide them down the treacherous slope. It was in these conditions, tired, cold, and battling against nature's fury, that disaster struck. Chapter 5. The fall had happened in an instant. One moment, Joe was carefully making his way down an ice face, his crampons biting into the frozen surface. The next, he was falling through the air, his world a chaotic blur of white and darkness. The impact when he hit the slope was devastating, sending shockwaves of pain through his body. As he came to a stop, the full extent of his situation became clear. His right leg was shattered, the pain unlike anything he had ever experienced. He lay there in the snow, the storm raging around him, fighting against the waves of agony and the creeping tendrils of panic. Simon, who had watched in horror as his partner fell, sprang into action. Fighting against the wind and snow, he made his way to Joe. The sight that greeted him was grim. Joe was badly injured, and they were still high on the mountain, in the middle of a raging storm. What followed was a desperate struggle against time, nature, and the limits of human endurance. Simon began the painstaking process of lowering Joe down the mountain, using their ropes and his ice axe. It was slow, dangerous work, made all the more treacherous by the continuing storm and the darkness that enveloped them. Chapter 6. The crevasse. As the night wore on, Joe and Simon's situation went from bad to worse. The process of lowering Joe was taking its toll on both men. Simon was exhausted, his hands raw and bleeding from handling the ropes. Joe, despite his best efforts to remain conscious and alert, found himself slipping in and out of awareness, the pain and cold overwhelming his senses. Then, in a moment that would change both their lives forever, disaster struck again. As Simon was lowering Joe through the darkness, suddenly the rope went slack. Joe had fallen into a hidden crevasse, a gaping wound in the glacier's surface. The moment of the fall was surreal for Joe. Time seemed to slow as he plummeted into the icy depths. The walls of the crevasse rushed past him, a blur of blue and white in the beam of his headlamp. Then, abruptly, he jerked to a stop, suspended in the darkness by the rope that connected him to Simon. For Simon, the situation was a nightmare. He could feel the pull of Joe's weight threatening to drag him off the mountain. With visibility near zero and unsure of Joe's condition, he faced an impossible choice. After what seemed like an eternity, but was in reality only a few minutes, Simon made the agonizing decision to cut the rope. It was a moment that would haunt both men for years to come, an act of survival that felt like a betrayal. For Joe, the sensation of the rope going slack was the embodiment of absolute abandonment. In that moment, suspended in the icy void, he felt more alone than he had ever felt in his life. Chapter 7. Depths of despair as the reality of his situation sank in, Joe was overwhelmed by a wave of despair. He was badly injured, trapped in an ice crevasse in one of the most remote parts of the Andes. The odds of survival seemed impossibly slim. The crevasse was like something out of a nightmare, walls of ice stretching up to a thin strip of sky far above. The cold was all-encompassing, seeping into his very bones. Every movement sent shards of pain through his broken leg, and he could feel the early stages of frostbite setting into his extremities. In these dark moments, Joe's mind became his worst enemy. Thoughts of a slow, lonely death in the icy depths tormented him. He thought of his family, his friends, all the things he would never see or do again. The weight of his mortality pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. But even in this darkest of moments, a small spark of defiance flickered within Joe. He was not ready to die, not ready to let the mountain claim him. With gritted teeth and a determination born of desperation, he began to formulate a plan. Fascinated by the psychological aspects of survival? Join our webinar series, Mind vs. Mountain, and learn from experts in extreme psychology and seasoned survivors. Part 3, The Battle for Survival, Chapter 8. The decision to live with his leg badly broken and his spirit nearly crushed, Joe faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. Give up and die, or fight against impossible odds. In that moment, suspended in the icy void of the crevasse, Joe chose life. The decision to live was more than just a fleeting thought. It was a commitment, a contract with himself. Joe knew that if he was going to survive, he would need every ounce of strength, both physical and mental, that he could muster. He began to take stock of his situation, assessing his injuries and his resources. His right leg was undoubtedly broken, possibly in multiple places. He had some food and water, but not nearly enough for an extended period. His clothing, while designed for mountaineering, was not meant to withstand prolonged exposure to such extreme cold. And perhaps most critically, he had no way of knowing if anyone was looking for him, or even if they knew where to look. Despite these grim realities, Joe refused to succumb to despair. He began to break down his survival into manageable tasks. The first step was clear. He needed to get out of his current position, suspended in the crevasse, and find a way to the bottom. Chapter 9. Descent into the unknown with a plan in mind, Joe began the arduous process of lowering himself to the bottom of the crevasse. Every movement was an exercise in agony. His broken leg hung uselessly, and he had to rely entirely on his upper body strength and his good leg to control his descent. The process was painstakingly slow. Joe would lower himself a few feet, then stop to rest, his labored breathing echoing in the confined space of the crevasse. The cold was relentless, numbing his fingers and making each action a test of will. But inch by agonizing inch, he made his way down. As he descended, Joe's mind raced with thoughts and memories. He thought of Simon, wondering if his partner had survived the storm. He thought of his family, imagining their worry and fear. And he thought of all the climbs he had done, all the challenges he had faced, drawing strength from the knowledge that he had overcome difficult situations before. After what seemed like an eternity, Joe's feet touched the bottom of the crevasse. The relief was momentary, quickly replaced by a new wave of despair as he took in his surroundings. The bottom of the crevasse was a narrow space, with walls of ice stretching up into darkness on all sides. It seemed like a tomb, a place where hope came to die. But as Joe's eyes adjusted to the gloom, he made a surprising discovery. There was a slope leading deeper into the glacier, but also upward. It was a faint hope, but it was all he had. With renewed determination, he began to formulate the next phase of his plan. Chapter 10. The long crawl with no other option, Joe began the grueling process of crawling up the sloping ice tunnel. The journey that followed was a testament to human endurance and the power of the will to live. Using his good leg and his arms, Joe dragged himself through the ice tunnel. Every movement was agony. Every inch gained a victory against the mountain that sought to claim him. Time lost all meaning in the blue-white world of ice. Joe's progress was painstakingly slow. He measured his journey not in miles, but in yards gained per hour. The pain was constant. Hunger and thirst as constant companions. He would crawl until exhaustion overtook him, sleep fitfully in the numbing cold, then wake and continue his journey. As he crawled, Joe's mind became a battlefield. Hallucinations plagued him. Visions of rescue, of warm fires and friendly faces. But each time, reality would reassert itself, cold and unyielding. He talked to himself, sang songs, recited poetry. Anything to maintain his sanity in the face of overwhelming isolation. The physical toll of the journey was immense. Joe's hands and knees were raw from constant contact with the ice. His broken leg, dragged behind him, was a constant source of agony. Frostbite nipped at his extremities, and dehydration made every movement a Herculean effort. But still, he pressed on. Each inch forward was a defiance of the mountain, a testament to his will to survive. In the depths of the glacier, Joe was fighting not just for his life, but for his very humanity. Chapter 11. Mind games as the days wore on. Joe's greatest battle was not against the mountain or his injuries, but against his own mind. The isolation and the constant struggle for survival began to take their toll on his psyche. He found himself grappling with profound questions about life, death, and the nature of existence. There were moments of despair so deep that giving up seemed not just easy, but logical. The constant pain, the gnawing hunger, the bone-deep cold, all of it wore away at his resolve. More than once, Joe found himself contemplating the peace that would come with simply stopping, with letting the mountain take him. But something within him refused to yield. It was more than just survival instinct. It was a fierce determination to see the sky again, to feel the sun on his face, to prove that he was more than just a victim of the mountain. Joe began to see his struggle as something larger than himself. He was fighting not just for his own life, but for everyone who had ever faced overwhelming odds. To keep his mind active and ward off the creeping tendrils of madness, Joe employed various mental strategies. He would set small goals for himself. Reach that rock, make it to the next bend in the ice tunnel. He replayed favorite movies in his head, recited books he had read, and held imaginary conversations with friends and family. One particularly effective technique was to imagine himself in other places. He would visualize himself on a warm beach, feeling the sun on his skin and the sand between his toes. Other times, he would imagine foot to chapter 12. Transformation in ice continued. Joe's relationship with the mountain and with nature itself underwent a profound shift. At first, he had seen Sula Grande as an adversary, a challenge to be conquered. Now, as he crawled through its icy innards, he began to see it differently. The mountain was neither malevolent nor benevolent. It simply was. This realization brought a strange sort of peace, a sense of being part of something vast and ancient. The glacier, which had seemed like a death trap, revealed moments of austere beauty. The play of light through the ice, the intricate patterns of frost. These small wonders became anchors for Joe's sanity. He found himself marveling at the complex structures within the ice, the way sunlight refracted through it, creating rainbow prisms, the soft blue glow that permeated his world. This newfound appreciation for the beauty around him didn't make his situation any less dire, but it did provide a mental lifeline. It gave him something to focus on beyond the pain and despair, a reminder that there was still wonder in the world. Chapter 13. The voice in the ice as Joe's journey stretched on. He began to experience something unexpected, a voice. At first, he dismissed it as a hallucination, a product of his exhausted and dehydrated mind. But the voice persisted, becoming clearer and more insistent as time went on. It wasn't the voice of a person, not exactly. It was more like the voice of the mountain itself, or perhaps his own subconscious taking on a life of its own. Whatever its source, the voice became Joe's companion in the lonely depths of the glacier. Sometimes the voice was encouraging, urging him to keep moving when all he wanted to do was give up. Other times it was pragmatic, helping him think through survival strategies or pointing out potential dangers in his path. And sometimes, in his darkest moments, it was simply there, a presence that reminded him he wasn't entirely alone. Joe found himself engaging in long conversations with the voice, debating philosophy, reminiscing about past climbs, and speculating about the future. These dialogues helped keep his mind sharp, and provided a much-needed distraction from the constant pain and cold. As he continued his grueling crawl, Joe began to wonder if he was losing his grip on reality. Was the voice a sign of madness setting in? Or was it a coping mechanism, his mind's way of helping him survive? In the end, he decided it didn't matter. The voice was helping him stay alive, and that was all that counted. Asterisk, ever wondered how the mind adapts in extreme situations? Join our survival psychology online course and explore the fascinating world of human resilience. Asterisk Chapter 14. The physical toll. While Joe's mental battle was intense, the physical demands of his ordeal were equally challenging. His body, already pushed to its limits by the initial climb and fall, was now being asked to perform feats of endurance that seemed almost superhuman. The broken leg was a constant source of agony. Every movement sent shards of pain shooting through his body, and he could feel the broken ends of bone grinding together. He tried to immobilize it as best he could, but the nature of his crawl meant that some movement was unavoidable. Dehydration became an ever-present threat. The cold, dry air of the glacier sapped moisture from his body at an alarming rate. He tried to eat snow to quench his thirst, but this only served to lower his body temperature further. He had to ration his water carefully, taking only small sips when the thirst became unbearable. Hunger gnawed at him constantly. The energy bars and dried food he had in his pack were quickly exhausted, and soon he was running on nothing but willpower and determination. His body began to consume itself, burning through fat reserves and then muscle mass to keep him alive. The cold was perhaps the most relentless enemy. It seeped into his bones, making every movement a battle against stiffening joints and numbing extremities. Frostbite began to set in, turning his fingers and toes into useless, painful appendages. Despite these challenges, Joe's body demonstrated an incredible capacity for adaptation. His senses sharpened, allowing him to navigate the dim, icy world around him. His remaining leg grew stronger, bearing the brunt of his movement. Even his broken leg seemed to find ways to be useful, serving as a sort of rudder as he dragged himself along. Chapter 15. A glimpse of sky after what seemed like an eternity of crawling through the icy labyrinth. Joe began to notice a change. The quality of light filtering through the ice was shifting, becoming brighter and more direct. The air, too, seemed different, fresher somehow, with hints of a world beyond the glacier. Hope, which had been little more than a faint ember in his chest, began to flare to life. Could he be nearing the edge of the glacier? The possibilities spurred him on, giving him a renewed burst of energy. As he rounded a bend in the ice tunnel, Joe's heart nearly stopped. There, in the distance, was a patch of open sky. It was small, little more than a pinprick of blue in a world of white. But to Joe, it was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. The elation that flooded through him was almost overwhelming. After days of darkness and confinement, the prospect of open air and sunlight seemed almost too good to be true. But there it was, growing larger with each painful foot of progress he made. As he neared the opening, however, Joe realized that his ordeal was far from over. The exit from the glacier was not at ground level, but rather open onto a steep slope of snow and rock. To reach safety, he would need to navigate this treacherous terrain with his broken body. The challenge ahead was daunting, but Joe refused to let despair take hold again. He had come too far, endured too much, to give up now. With gritted teeth and steely determination, he prepared himself for the final stage of his journey. Chapter 16. The world beyond the ice emerging from the glacier was like being born anew. The sunlight, which Joe had feared he might never see again, was almost painfully bright after days in the dim blue world of ice. The fresh air felt like a shock to his system, rich with scents he had almost forgotten: earth, vegetation, life. But there was no time to bask in the sensory overload. Joe knew that he was still in a precarious position. He was badly injured, severely dehydrated, and miles from any hope of rescue. The slope before him was steep and unstable, a treacherous mix of loose rock and unpredictable snow. With agonizing slowness, Joe began to make his way down the slope. Every movement was a negotiation between the need for speed and the risk of further injury. He used his ice axe as a makeshift crutch, testing each placement before committing his weight. The going was incredibly tough. The bright sunlight, which had seemed like such a blessing, now became an enemy. It reflected harshly off the snow, nearly blinding him and making it difficult to judge distances. The heat, too, was a mixed blessing. While it provided relief from the bone-deep cold of the glacier, it also accelerated the melting of the snow, making the surface even more treacherous. As he descended, Joe's mind raced with new concerns. Would Simon and their base camp team still be searching for him? How long had he been in the glacier? The concept of time had become so warped during his ordeal that he genuinely had no idea how many days had passed. Despite these worries, a new feeling was beginning to take hold, a cautious optimism. He was out of the glacier. He could see the valley below. For the first time since his fall, rescue seemed like a real possibility rather than a distant dream. Asterisk inspired by stories of incredible human endurance. Don't miss our podcast series, Survival Chronicles. Subscribe now and get exclusive access to interviews with real-life survivors. Asterisk Chapter 17. The final push as the day wore on, Joe's progress down the slope became increasingly difficult. His body, pushed well beyond its limits, was beginning to shut down. Each step was a monumental effort of will, his muscles screaming in protest with every movement. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in hues of gold and pink. It was a breathtakingly beautiful sight, but for Joe, it brought only dread. He knew that to be caught on the open mountainside after dark would likely mean death. His clothing, damaged and inadequate after days in the glacier, would provide little protection against the freezing night temperatures. It was in this moment of desperation that Joe made a decision that would become one of the most famous aspects of his survival story. He decided to break his journey into manageable segments, using a song to measure time and distance. The song he chose was Brown Girl in the Ring by Boney M. Joe set himself the task of crawling for the duration of the song, then allowing himself a brief rest before starting again. This method gave him a way to structure his efforts, to push through the pain and exhaustion in measured bursts. As he continued his agonizing descent, punctuated by the rhythm of the song playing over and over in his head, Joe's world narrowed to a singular focus. Each repetition of the song became a small battle, a test of will against the mountain and his own failing body. Chapter 18. The valley floor. As night began to fall in earnest, Joe finally reached the valley floor. The relative flatness of the terrain was a relief after the perilous descent, but new challenges quickly presented themselves. The valley was a maze of glacial moraine, unstable piles of rock, and debris left behind by the retreating glacier. Navigating this terrain in his weakened state was incredibly difficult. Joe had to crawl over and around boulders, some as large as cars. Each movement risked dislodging rocks, potentially causing a rock slide or further injuring himself. The darkness brought with it a bone-chilling cold. Without the exertion of the descent to keep him warm, Joe could feel his core temperature dropping rapidly. He knew that hypothermia was a very real threat. As he painstakingly made his way through the moraine, Joe began to hallucinate again. Exhaustion, dehydration, and the constant pain had taken their toll on his mind. He saw lights in the distance that disappeared when he blinked. He heard voices calling his name, only to be met with silence when he tried to respond. But amidst the hallucinations and despair, one thought kept him going. He was close. Base camp couldn't be far now. If he could just keep moving, just stay alive for a little longer, he might make it. Chapter 19. An unexpected sound as dawn broke on what Joe assumed must be his fourth or fifth day since the fall. He heard something that made his heart leap. The sound of running water. After days of nothing but the crunch of snow and ice, the gurgle of a stream was like music to his ears. More than that, it represented hope. Joe knew that following the stream downhill would likely lead him to base camp, or at least increase his chances of being found. With renewed determination, he began to crawl towards the sound. The stream, when he reached it, presented both opportunity and danger. The water was a godsend to his parched throat, but its icy temperature was a shock to his system. He knew he had to be careful. Drinking too much too quickly could be dangerous in his weakened state. As he rested by the stream, taking small sips of water, Joe allowed himself to think about rescue for the first time in days. He was out of the most treacherous terrain now. Surely, if Simon and the others were still searching, this would be where they'd look, with this hope kindling in his chest. Joe began to follow the stream downhill. The sound of the water became his guide, his lifeline, leading him towards what he hoped would be salvation. Chapter 20. The camp. As Joe rounded a bend in the valley, following the stream, he saw something that made him question his sanity once again. In the distance, barely visible, was a cluster of colorful shapes that could only be tents. For a long moment, Joe simply stared, convinced that his mind was playing tricks on him again. But as he blinked and rubbed his eyes, the image remained. The tents were real. He had found the camp. With a surge of adrenaline he didn't know he still possessed, Joe began to crawl faster. He tried to call out, but his parched throat produced little more than a croak. Still, he pressed on, determined to close the distance between himself and salvation. As he neared the camp, he finally heard what he had been longing to hear for days. Human voices. Real, unmistakable human voices. And then, a shout of surprise and recognition. "Oh my God! It's Joe!" The next few moments were a blur of activity. Hands were touching him. Voices were calling his name, asking him questions he couldn't process. The relief of being found, of being safe, was overwhelming, as the realization that his ordeal was finally over washed over him. Joe Simpson, the man who had defied death and conquered a mountain, did something he hadn't allowed himself to do in all his days of struggle. He wept. Epilogue. The long road home, Joe Simpson's rescue from the slopes of Silla Grande, was not the end of his journey, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. The physical injuries he had sustained during his ordeal were severe, requiring multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. The broken leg that had caused him so much agony during his crawl was in fact broken in 6 places and would require extensive reconstruction. But perhaps even more challenging than the physical recovery was the psychological impact of his experience. Joe struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and a deep-seated fear of enclosed spaces. The trauma of his time in the Glacier had left scars that were not visible but were no less real. Yet, true to the incredible resilience he had shown on the mountain, Joe faced these new challenges head-on. He threw himself into his recovery, pushing through the pain of physical therapy with the same determination that had seen him through his crawl down the mountain. As he recovered, Joe began to share his story. At first, it was just with friends and family, then with wider audiences. He found that talking about his experience was cathartic, helping him process the trauma and find meaning in what he had endured. His story resonated with people around the world, inspiring many with its testament to the power of human will and endurance. Joe went on to write books about his experience, including the best-selling Touching the Void, which was later made into a documentary film. Perhaps most surprisingly to those who knew his story, Joe eventually returned to climbing. The mountains, despite everything, still called to him. But he climbed now with a new perspective, a deep respect for the power of nature and a profound appreciation for life itself. Joe Simpson's journey on Silla Grande had taken him to the very brink of human endurance and brought him back again. It had shown him the darkest depths of despair and the brightest heights of the human spirit. In the end, it had transformed him, not just as a climber, but as a human being. His story stands as a testament to the incredible power of the human will to survive, a reminder that even in our darkest hours, there is always hope, always a reason to keep pushing forward. Joe Simpson didn't just survive Silla Grande. He emerged from it with a story that would inspire generations, a living example of the unbreakable human spirit. Asterisk, moved by Joe's incredible journey? Share your thoughts and reflections in our Survival Stories community forum. Join now and connect with fellow enthusiasts of human triumph. Asterisk reclimbs, planning routes and strategies in intricate detail. These mental escapes provided brief respites from the harsh reality of the situation.